Well, hello. I think we're going to get going. So it's nice to see you all. I hope you're doing well. My name is Tom Griffin. I'm an associate professor with the Ted Rogers School of Hospitality and Tourism Management at Ryerson University. I'm also the assistant director at the Institute for Hospitality and Tourism Research. Welcome to our event as part of the Main Street Reimagined project on how can data help a Main Street. So before we get going, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement for the land upon which Ryerson University is situated. So Toronto is in the District of One Spoon territory. The District of One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And of course, to acknowledge that Ryerson University is going through a process to change its name, which will be happening in the coming months. So this is part of the Institute for Hospitality and Tourism Research. So we're a group within our school, and we really just work towards conducting research that's of both scholarly value, but also is helpful to the practitioners in the industry. And we really, we're also looking to find students experience and connections to research and analytics within the industry. If you'd like to follow our institute, there's our website. I will drop a couple of links in the chat as we get going. And so this is our project. The project is called Main Street Reimagined through a visitor economy lens. And myself and Walter, who's also on the call, we are tourism people bringing tourism ideas to the Main Street and BIA community. That's what we're attempting to do. And so we've been doing some studies now for a couple of years, and we've turned this into a handbook. And so we are running these events, all of which are available on our website to watch the YouTube recordings. And also some PDF downloads of the different chapters and different sections that we're talking about aimed at the Main Street community. So I really encourage you to sign up for our newsletter and check out our website and find out some useful information there. Again, I'll drop some links in the chat once we get going. And so it's my pleasure today to welcome two guest speakers. We have Judy Morgan, who is a consultant with the 360 Collective. And Judy's going to talk to us for around 10 minutes about some of the key ideas about using data for Main Streets. And we also have Tim Kocur from the Waterfront BIA in Toronto. And Tim's going to walk us through a couple of examples of how they've used data to answer some important questions and some of the challenges that they've had as well. Both guest speakers are going to talk for between 10 and 15 minutes. And so there will be lots of time to ask questions at the end. So please feel free to raise your hand using Zoom, or to type your question into the chat, and I'll be happy to ask it on your behalf. So without further ado, Judy, thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like to share your screen, and it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Tom. And we'll just find my presentation here. There we go. And slide view. Or slideshow. There you are. Okay, so with luck, that should work.
Looks great.
Looks great. Perfect. Well, as Tom said, my name is Judy Morgan. I spent most of my career working for the City of Toronto in both planning and economic development. For a good chunk of that time, I worked on retail policy and Main Street programs and BIAs. And then for another chunk, I worked in tourism research and development, which actually, I think as this program is really demonstrating, has a lot of synergy with Main Street development. I'm now a freelance consultant, and I work quite often as part of 360 Collective, which is a group of senior specialists who we specialize in various aspects of retail analysis and development. So the information I'm going to share with you today was developed with John Archer, who is a member of 360 and regrets that he's unable to join us in person today. So why use data? This is an overview of kind of what Tim and I are going to talk about. I'm going to start out with some general guidelines on why use data, some general guidelines on using data, and then Tim is going to talk about the Waterfront BIA and how it uses data, and then we're opening up for discussion. So why use data? Basically, the quick answer is that objective empirical data helps you defend arguments and challenge or confirm gut feelings or inertia. So we strongly believe in the power of evidence-based decision-making. The kind of questions you can answer basically falls into these 6 broad general buckets. The first is who is coming and not coming to your BIA. And I'm going to spend a bit of time on this in the next slide, boring into that in a little bit detail. The second is your business characteristics, your business members if you're a BIA, what kinds of goods and services do they provide? Are they independent or chain stores? Are they owned by members of equity-seeking groups? And if so, is your BIA incorporating their points of view? And how is all that changing over time? The third bucket is real estate conditions and an understanding of the physical aspects of your main street and how they present opportunities or challenges. Do you really have a parking shortage? How many spaces are there, and what is their occupancy and rate of turnover throughout the week, for example? The fourth is the effectiveness of the BIA and your programming. In terms of measuring return on investment, I'll just note that aBIA, the Ontario BIA Association, did a large study and published some guidelines on that a few years ago, which is available for free on their website. Developing policy positions and being able to effectively advocate on behalf of your BIA interests is the next bucket. Impact analyses of what would happen to the businesses if a particular policy or infrastructure changes were made as an example of the kind of study that's often done. And certainly over the last 2 years during COVID, it's certainly shone a light on how some organizations were able to demonstrate the challenges businesses were facing as a result of lockdowns. And the 6th bucket, last but not least, don't forget to keep up to date with what's going on outside of your BIA. Is what you're observing a special case or a general trend? Free published data sources are online, as are industry-specific newsletters, and I'm going to throw a slide up towards the end of my presentation on a few examples. You can also join industry associations and access their resources fairly inexpensively. So here is an example of different approaches to data collection that can be taken to collecting data about who is coming and not coming to your main street. Please note that the different approaches are intended to be examples and are not comprehensive. So I kind of divided the approaches into 3 categories, and they're kind of shades of gray between one to the other, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. But even if you have 0 resources, you can still get out there, chat with businesses and their staff, people on the street, and record what they're talking and record what they say in a systematic way. So that's how you kind of translate anecdotal information into slightly more systematic data. Is if you record it, you can look at it over time. You can compare it to what others have told you. You might be able to enlist your board's members and some of your businesses to do the same. You might even set up an online forum where people can report in confidentially. This is not accurate or precise data and might not be sufficient to support a major investment or influence a major decision, but it does provide you with lots of directional insights. Something that stayed with me throughout my career is a comment made by the former CAO of the CN Tower many decades ago. His favorite lunch was a hot dog from a street vendor at the foot of the tower, and he always asked him about how business was, who was on the street, what were they saying, and then kept that immediate on-the-street intelligence in mind when he was reviewing all the data and trend analysis that his experts were giving him. So even if you are doing really detailed data analysis, it's still good to keep track with of the word on the street, so to speak, by the simple techniques. If you also collect a bit of demographic information in your chats, as well as postal codes, you can compare the people in the district with those living nearby and also get a sense for how many are visitors and local residents. Any wide discrepancies between the characteristics of the neighborhood residents and the people visiting give you an indication of who's coming and not coming from the local area. So then you can begin to think about what can you do to attract them. And then the information about the kind of people you're attracting from further away provides insights as to the strengths you can build on. So that's kind of an overview of how you can get some insights from a very simple, inexpensive type of data collection. The next level of research generates more precise and defendable data, but also begins to cost a little more. There are lots of third-party providers selling cell phone data and templated surveys, which costs less in some cases than one-off custom research, but you need to be really careful about asking questions and looking into the detail of their methodology. For example, cell phone data needs to be cleaned to remove data, for example, for people traveling through your areas without stopping, or you can get some really misleading information. The thorough bucket is what shopping center developers and retail corporations will be doing to evaluate alternative locations and investment opportunities. If you're interested in undertaking a recruitment program, you may need to do some of this analysis to provide to brokers and prospective tenants in order to put yourself on their radar screen. This kind of data is also really useful for marketing programs, helping you identify your competitive advantage relative to other shopping districts, and to assess which markets have the most untapped potential that could be attracted to your area. So moving on to the next slide. We could talk a lot more time about that last slide, and a similar approach could be taken to the other 5 categories of questions. And I'm happy to, if anyone has any specific questions, delve into that. But right now I wanted to move on to the general research and data collection guidelines to follow no matter what kind of research you're undertaking. So to maximize the results of your research, no matter what you're doing, you need to remember these 4 things. The first is to spend a lot of time defining and writing down, and I really emphasize writing down because it's amazing how your thoughts about what you want to find out can morph over time. It's good to write it down so that you don't end up, and then you can consciously change that if things change, but at least you know what you wanted to find out when you started. Why do you want to find it out? How do you want to use the information? Get down to the specifics and involve your key stakeholders. So this is a really good starting point, and then you can go through and check the checklist that emerges and decide on what your priorities are and how you're going to tackle each piece. The second key point is should be done in parallel with the first. Who will see the analysis? What are they interested in? For example, if you're trying to influence investment decisions, make sure you know what retailers or retailer developers are interested in knowing, and make sure your research program and information summaries hits those points in a clear and credible way. The third is to be clear about definitions and methodology. For example, what do you want included in the term retail? Are car dealerships in or out? What about services, especially food services? They account for an increasing amount of floor space, but often aren't captured in some of the standard retail data sources. In or out. Know what you're capturing and think about the ramification of that on the results. For example, cell phone data doesn't pick up people who don't have cell phones or who are carrying phones on airplane mode to avoid roaming charges. Each survey methodology has its own set of biases based on the number of people who you can reach and their propensity to answer surveys. And then when you're purchasing data, you need to also ask lots of questions to make sure you're getting what you think. The fourth point is to accept that no single source of data is ever perfect. And that really is true, at least in my experience. You often have to build the pictures from several different sources, seeing if they are directionally aligned, and if not, why not? And then use your experience or consult with others to fill in the gaps or to make estimates. But you almost never will be 100% certain about what the exact number is. Fortunately, being in the right ballpark is usually sufficient. So I promised you some sources of free information, and here are some of the more common ones. And as I say, I'll be providing, Tom will have this later on his website, so you don't have to frantically write out all of these URLs. I haven't included on the slide the fact that for lower cost research studies, you might also try reaching out to local colleges and universities to involve their students. and to get some assistance through the universities. And I also haven't listed the various industry associations. The US Main Street program is a great source for best practices, and the International Downtown Association, which used to be really strongly American-based, now has a Canadian chapter. Although not Main Street specific, many organizations such as the Canadian Restaurant Association and the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses do studies and publish information relevant to Main Street businesses. And I just learned last week that aBIA is launching a new CRM tool to help BIAs collect and track analytics. They'll be introducing it at their conference in 2 weeks, and I understand it's to become available to BIAs in 2023. So that is a whirlwind overview of how to use data. I'm happy to answer any questions during the discussion period, but for now, over to you, Tim. I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Judy. That was great.
Hi, hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, it looks good. Thanks, Tim.
So yeah, thanks everyone. I'm Tim Kocur with the Waterfront BIA. And just for a little bit of background, I've been here about just over 3.5 years. And I had previously been with the Financial District BIA when it was started about 9 or 10 years ago in Toronto. So a few examples I'll give if you're wondering why I'm talking about the Financial District BIA, it's because I used to work there. So some context on the Waterfront BIA in Toronto, we call it like, there's kind of 6 downtown big BIAs that are kind of all along the Yonge Street corridor heading north in one way or another. We represent basically everything south of the Gardiner as our northern boundary. And the sort of biggest project that our staff have had in the last few years was to make sure we expanded to this eastern waterfront. So all the green on this is buildings that are either under construction right now or will be built this decade. And so it was very clear when I got here that we needed to make sure there didn't become a second BIA down here. And so a number of the stories you'll hear from me are, we got into some of these data conversations because my perspective was that you can't go and tell these people we will eventually provide you value. You had to go down and say, hey, we're already providing you value and representing you. It will be a huge mistake if you start another business association on the waterfront. That was kind of the position we had to take to make sure we got that boundary expansion. So our mandate, we did a rebranding about a year ago after the expansion process was complete. The expansion process was 1.5 to 2 years on itself. And at a high level, we say we support businesses, and that includes sharing information like what I'm going to show you, just to provide more context with how the area is growing. We look to engage the community, and what we mean by that is both in person and online. This BIA had actually been very strong before I was here at doing a number of additional events and public art activations that were quite prominent on the waterfront. We're still trying to catch up to that in a way with the pandemic, but fortunately before the pandemic, we'd really shifted to doing a lot more online promotion, and so that allowed us to be a little bit more impactful through the pandemic. And we also say that we unify the waterfront. So I'll get into that in a couple slides, but first I'll kind of discuss like the waterfront that needs unifying. So when you're down here in this BIA, I always joke that we're like the 7th biggest stakeholder, and when we expanded, we became like a slightly larger 7th biggest stakeholder. And the reason why, we don't own any property down here. You guys know what a BIA is, so I don't have to explain that. But there's all these larger organizations that represent different levels of government working together, and they're all hopefully impactful on their own. But it's very surprising when you realize how many times they're not talking to each other, or where there's these issues where just an introduction we make or providing them with some sort of report or data set actually helps inform their decisions. And I find the way I describe this job is we spend a lot of time at the BIA politely nudging the other waterfront stakeholders in a certain direction that we think will benefit our businesses. And like just to give you an example, there's a Terry Fox monument that will be built down in one of our parks this summer. And we're actually a small part of the funding, but what had happened was that there was a philanthropist family that was willing to fund an entire monument to Terry Fox, but you can't raise money in Terry Fox's name. You actually literally, all money has to go to cancer research. So it has to be funded through other means and not through just charitable donations. And so we essentially were able to put in some money, which is like 10% of the total budget for it, but we were able to introduce them to a number of other partners who could take on parts of the construction or actually like get them approvals and things. And we actually basically nudged it like over the tipping point to making sure it got done. So just an example of kind of how we operate here is usually we very, very rarely are doing something on our own. So if it looks like we do a lot, it's not just us, it's usually us working with at least one other partner on the waterfront. And in terms of size of our staff here, we actually have 5 full-time staff this year. We'll be adding a 6th person this year, actually. If you're looking for an entry-level communications job, reach out to us right now. And I also should give credit, I believe he's probably listening in. Oliver Hurley-High works with us. He's, I'm taking credit for quite a few projects that he has actually taken the lead on. Just very general background, things that you guys know all BIAs do. We spend a lot of time promoting our businesses any way we can. Also events and activations. In a lot of cases, again, unifying the waterfront, working with the other waterfront partners. A lot of times we're doing something where we're making sure something happens on the waterfront by sponsoring it, like this massive Judy Chicago Smoke Show will be down here on June 4th because we were able to sponsor it enough to make sure it happened here as opposed to somewhere else. And there's also like strategic goals that we support through, in some cases data, in some cases just helping people with almost like PR and stuff like this. We have these malting silos that actually, it was just announced OCAD is going to do a project in here. So we for years have been trying to highlight the potential of this site by sponsoring any type of artwork where people can project something on the silos and highlight that that space could become a landmark. And now it looks like the city is working with OCAD to actually come up with something more permanent for a 5-year test period on that site. So we're always just trying to nudge things in the right direction. Sometimes it doesn't cost a lot of money. Oh, and then we do cleaning and issue reporting, but I think you guys already know about that sort of thing. So, okay, so to get to different ways I have used data in my career, and I'm going to say here that I do not consider myself any form of data analysis wizard. I actually come to this from, my master's degree was in journalism, and even though I was never a journalist, I always kind of joke that the further I've gotten away from journalism, that degree has actually been more valuable because I'm getting fairly good at taking like a few data points and like telling a story with it. And I sort of have this joke that we don't manipulate data with BIAs, but you always have to massage the data because you don't know what you have. You're always trying to like combine data with like some sort of anecdote. And it always seems to like work that way where you're kind of like playing with data to try and tell a story, but you can never only rely on data. So how I sort of got into this was with the Financial District BIA, we were asked to get involved in some tax policy issues. And I would literally do things this simple where I would help write a document for aBIA where I would just show like, look how much more tax these other businesses are paying and or how much less people are paying in other municipalities around Toronto on the business education tax. And it was just that the only reports out there were extraordinarily dry writing on these tax issues. And so to go to a politician and ask for help with an issue, you wanted to just like point to something and be like, here's the problem. Look, compare this number to this number's bigger. And I was always trying to think of things like that. And we came up with some ways that it was more effective. We also started doing, and Judy mentioned this, but sometimes we have BIAs get fortunate to use like an educational institution to do something more affordable than we normally would. I think we did this survey of 1,000 people who worked in the financial district, because in the financial district, you don't do a resident survey. No one lives there. So no one had done a survey outside of one building about like where people were commuting from, how much people were spending, what types of businesses they wanted to see. And so one summer I think we used 50 different volunteer students to ask people like intercept surveys. And it was just a survey we wrote ourselves. So for an extremely affordable budget of almost zero, we basically wrote this survey. And when it came out, the Toronto Star actually did like a big feature about like, this report helps you understand the financial district from a new angle. It was really interesting. So I kind of just learned as I went, as like some of these issues I was just asked to look into. And with my kind of journalism background and reading other people's reports and finding data that was available, we started having an impact on some of these policy files. And one of the most interesting things I've ever worked on in my career was the city was going around saying they were going to raise $500 million in new tax revenue by parking spaces. And everyone thought that was great, except for the real estate developers in big offices and malls. And the way you'd hear the city, they thought they were saying like, oh, it's only going to be a tax on the big malls and the big offices. They can afford it, which is actually true. But we were very easily able to show them that the 2 million parking spaces that would get them that revenue, like 90% of it was in the suburbs. Like those are actually where all the parking spaces are. It's just like so I found, this was my most famous example, was I literally just went on Google and counted the parking spaces at this funeral home in Scarborough. And then we showed the budget committee chair, hey, this is the funeral home in your ward. They're going to pay an extra $35,000 a year with your tax. Did you think of that? Like, you're not going to raise this rent. And so it was actually very easy. And when the mayor had his statement that we can't have this parking levy tax, he actually referred to, he's like, funeral homes will have to pay too much. And it was because I didn't show it to the mayor, but someone else showed it to the mayor. So it was kind of like this interesting thing where I just started to really like that part of my job, where if I could tell a story in a fairly simple way, it would actually like somehow make its way to the right decision makers. So here at the Waterfront BIA, probably one of the most impactful things I've done in the last 3.5 years I've been here was everybody down here wants to get this Eastern Waterfront LRT built. Everyone just assumes it's eventually going to get built. It is not funded. And so when I got down here, I was like, you guys want this funded? Like, I can't find any information about this thing. And so for a fairly reasonable amount, which I won't share, we got an engineering firm to do a study about here's what the tax uplift would be. And it basically showed that if you could get this LRT built a decade or two early, because it's not planned until the 2040s, believe it or not, for this whole network, it would raise, over the next 20 years, all three levels of government would have an extra $22 billion in revenue. So we were able to kind of show politicians very easily, like, hey, if you get this built faster, it will literally pay for itself over the next couple of decades. And so that was something that we just kind of came up with and did ourselves because that data didn't exist. So we went and got it. Like even the larger waterfront stakeholders either didn't have this or were not able to share it. Since the pandemic, some of you may have seen that the downtown 6 BIAs, along with the city, have been funding this occupancy index, which is actually quite complicated in that they actually call a whole bunch of office buildings every 2 weeks and ask them for their numbers of how many people are coming back to work, which is, you'll probably see another one this week where it'll probably be above 20% for the first time. But it's, as you can see, it's been a long slog with that one. But again, just trying to provide information that didn't exist. We were doing this before anyone else was in the downtown core. And then another thing, so this was kind of related to when we expanded, we started doing a bit of this before we expanded, but then we also, once we had expanded our boundaries, we had to do like a new data summary. We had to very quickly get all the available information that we could get our hands on into our business's hands again from like the broader perspective of we now represent this entire waterfront as opposed to our data kind of having questions around it about why is this only representing half the waterfront by that time. So I'll just highlight certain things. Oliver actually found this vendor, this guy on Twitter, Future Model TO, and he does these really interesting maps. He has a model of the whole city and a bunch of planning data. And I can't remember how much it cost, but it wasn't very expensive. We were able to get like this really interesting visualization of how quickly the area was growing, which I actually use this as the introduction slide that you saw earlier to explain our boundaries. Because the most interesting thing is to kind of show how much of the city's growth is happening all down here. We, of course, share with our businesses whenever we can get up-to-date information from the city or different sources from consultants. We will just purchase that data and put it into our own formats about like demographic growth in the neighborhood, jobs and residents. Also spending data, like things like the stats can, if they have we'll hopefully have that in the next year, we'll have the updated purchasing info and we use a service area around our BIA. I don't know if this seems obvious to us, but maybe it isn't to others, where like our BIA boundaries are very specific, but nobody really cares. I mean, nobody would talk about the waterfront as these lines and not these lines. So we do a service area, I believe, of 800 meters around our BIA. So it's assuming that basically the people who can easily walk to our neighborhood to go to our businesses, that's what we use as, we call them waterfront like service area residents. And also we try to, wherever we can, we'll collect information from kind of sources that aren't as official, but are helpful. Like we try to support the boat industry down here because there's a few, so it's sort of one of the business classifications that's very unique to our neighborhood. So we try to support them where we can. And they do their own quick summary once in a while. Like the pre-pandemic year, we know that they had 450,000 trips out into the harbor. And we know how many part-time jobs they had seasonally in the summer. And so we can use that in our advocacy as well on their behalf. One thing that this was in place before I started, they had pedestrian counters east-west on the waterfront. And the reason why I describe that is why we do east-west is because on the waterfront, you really want to, the ferry terminal and Harborfront Center are already quite busy. For us, we really want to be able to show that we're pulling people to other parts of the waterfront. So for instance, we spend a lot more promoting and sponsoring things like events and public art if they're not in the center core of our area. We spend very little on the Harborfront Center site. But if somebody has an idea that might pull people down to the eastern waterfront, where a lot of people don't even know you can go there yet, then we'll spend more on that. And so we release these pedestrian counts. We do like an end of year summary that we send out the first week of January. Excuse me. But then we also, after every long weekend in the summer, so starting on the May 2-4 long weekend, usually by Wednesday of the next week, we can send out a summary that compares that long weekend to previous years and also does like a year-to-date summary of how busy we've been different months and such. And the reason why we do that is because that's when we get questions about it. It's after the long weekends in the summer. The traffic on the waterfront for pedestrians and visitors is very, very, very dependent on weather. And so a lot of the questions you get is just comparing like, hey, it seemed busier. And so we can kind of prove it to people based on using these numbers and comparing it. So we use them. It's almost like a discussion document, but also just confirms people's assumptions and gives us something we can share at the busiest times of the year. And another thing that we did with 360 Collective was we purchased a bunch of cell phone data to see where people were visiting from. So origin of visitors, meaning these were people who geofence visited a public space in our area, one of the 6 largest parks in our neighborhood. And so it doesn't count people like me. I live and work down here. I don't count because I'm down here every day. It only counted people who came from outside the BI's area and came into it. So we compared a year before and after the pandemic. And there's sort of multiple reasons to do work like this. And we're still finding out how to use this study, to be honest. I mean, part of it is for the LRT advocacy, trying to get the funding built, we can tell councillors in Scarborough that since the pandemic, 1 out of every 8 people who's visited the waterfront was from Scarborough. And it's very much because they're probably people who don't have backyards and parks very accessible. This is how they experience the waterfront, is this like beautiful, evolving, hopefully eventually world-class waterfront that's like coming outward from the central waterfront here. And then we also, so we did this report, but then this is actually Waterfront Toronto's communications from one of their recent presentations we see them do. And they actually took our report and used it for their own purposes to show like how many people came from outside the Toronto area, from the GTA and from around the world. This is of course the year before the pandemic. Before and after the pandemic, it went from 17% of visitors were outside of Canada to 1%. So hopefully we'll be a little bit better this year. And of course, it's not all a good story. I mean, this is where you're massaging the data, where, of course, we all know that the waterfront was not that busy since the pandemic, but the pedestrian counts actually stayed pretty much as high, especially in the spring, as people were like kind of coming out of lockdowns the last 2 years. We actually saw higher pedestrian counts in the spring both years than we did in the year before the pandemic. But we also know from our businesses that people were not shopping as much. So we knew it was a lot of people biking because they didn't have anything else to do on weekends and nowhere else to go. And so that was borne out by the visitor origins, where you can see the number of visitors from outside GTA and the rest of Canada down 74%. So like this was the year before the pandemic and the year after. So we also have to share the very honest data that's not always telling the brightest picture. And this is my last slide. So I kind of mentioned this up top, but because I have a journalism background, I kind of got into this by accident. Like I like to joke that I didn't know what aBIA did until I worked for one for 3 weeks, because I find that having this sort of information available, these studies and all these pedestrian counts and things, it's just good for when you're asked for your opinion on something, you more often have something to point to. So the reason why I'm showing media hits here and things on Twitter was that, like at the start of the pandemic, we were getting calls from journalists about, is it busy or business is suffering? And we actually had things to point to. We could say like, actually the pedestrian counts are quite high. However, it's not as many. And we could point to like anecdotal evidence that it was more cyclists and recreational users. And so there's just, and also in policy debates, like that thing I told you about Scarborough, 1 in 8 visitors since the pandemic's from Scarborough, that was almost accidental, was that we were just talking to councillors in Scarborough about getting transit built. And of course, they'd rather see investment in Scarborough, but we're able to show them like, actually, no, the waterfront, like development of more parks along our central waterfront actually benefits people in Scarborough because they come down here. It's essentially the backyard for all of Toronto now. So it's just, a lot of these sources are probably available to pretty much everyone. I mean, sometimes we write specialized reports and things, but that's kind of my approach to how we look at using data.
That's great. Thanks so much, Tim, and to Judy as well. Some great points, some great stories, some great lessons. I'd like to open it up to questions from people on the call. Please feel free to raise your hand, come off mute, or type into the chat. So if anybody does have any questions, please go ahead. While we're waiting, there were a couple of really interesting points for me that came up. We've got a Carly's question in the chat. Let's do that. So Carly asked, what technology are you using for the pedestrian count? So I guess that's to Tim.
It's a company called Kocur. I should be able to find them online. If you have trouble, email us. They're not super expensive. I feel like it's in a few thousands. You can get at least one counter. I don't remember it being more than like 10,000 even to install a series of them. Kocur, ECO.
Great. Thank you. I mean, one of the questions that I had that came up from both your presentations really was the reason to do research and so or to collect data. And I guess the two options there are, are you collecting data to prove a point and to show something is successful, and so it gives you that information that you can advocate in a way, or are you collecting data to really learn about whether something's working, maybe more internal reasons that you kind of want to test things out? And I wonder if either of you had anything to say about those two directions.
Shall I start?
Please.
Yeah, to me, both of those. I don't think you should collect data if you don't know why you want the data, which some people sometimes do because they think they should. You kind of need to have a purpose before you get into data collection. Would be my perspective. The work I do tends to be really user focused as opposed to curiosity driven, I suppose you could say. So I think you and as I say, back to the presentation, there's so many reasons, but I think the only reason to collect data if you don't have an exact purpose is to kind of know how your area stands relative to other areas. And then you would be using those the general sources and having a general knowledge of your business mix and who you serve. But if you're doing programming, you should be able to show the results from that. You need to be in a position, as Tim's really talked about, of being able to advocate and affect policy. And then, informing marketing programs, informing who's coming to your events, which events should we host, the whole raft of it. So kind of scrambly answer, but...
I mean, I guess it's the question of, for example, if you're trying to measure the impact of a festival, are you attempting to measure? Are you attempting to get information that's going to help you get more sponsorship and show how many people came and that this is a really good thing, and you kind of want to promote that this is a good thing to keep going, or are you collecting data to really kind of assess the impact of that festival for the community in a kind of more critical way to say, well, actually, is this something we should be doing? Should we be changing it? And I guess, for me, there's kind of two slightly different directions. I guess you need to know that going in.
Yeah, I think really, truly all of the above. If you've got sponsors, you need to be able to demonstrate to your sponsors the relationship between the money they gave you and their ROI too. So, and then if you're also for grants, if you're applying for grants for your festivals, you need to demonstrate how you've achieved whatever it was you said you would do in your grant application. And then proving to your board of management or to yourself that, yes, it's worth the effort that we're putting into to host this particular festival versus something else we could be doing with that time and resources. So yeah, you need to be, as I say, you need to be clear at the beginning about what you want to find out.
Great, thanks, Judy. Tim, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think I generally agree with that. I would just say, if you want to have access to as many different data sources just to confirm what other things are saying. Like, for instance, the events. I mean, we've seen reports put together by event operators that suggest the event was much better attended than it actually was, based on, I walked around that day and I noticed it wasn't that busy, it was raining, you know what I mean? So our pedestrian counts can, in a lot of cases, we love getting our hands on data that we can afford. And then if we really have a purpose or a question that we really want to answer, that's when we're willing to do an RFP for something a bit more ambitious. But in a lot of cases, yeah, if we find out that something's affordable for us to grab, we'll just do it. What I was going to mention is I have this anecdotal story. I was potentially going to have a slide about doing really small sample size data. And because I'm a big fan of that, because it's really kind of, you can mix the anecdote with a bit of data and usually tell a story really well if you know what the question is. And at the end of the pandemic, the end of the first summer of the pandemic, we had an intern that summer, and we just sent him out and said, go ask 100 people where they came from in Toronto, which postal code, and what they're doing down here. And he came up with this, I actually have it if you want to see it, but he came up with this really funny graph where it showed things like 18% of people were down here on a date. But it also showed that 2/3 of the people who visited the waterfront were from south of Dundas, which we were pretty sure of, but we wanted some evidence from that. And when we sent out those pedestrian counts, that's the least sophisticated thing that was in it. And that's the only thing anyone asked us questions about or mentioned the next week when they ran into us on the street. And another interesting thing it showed, which was important, was he came and asked me, actually, he's like, I talked to 100 people, but 2 people said they didn't have a home. And I was like, no, leave that in, because that's actually extremely important. If 1 out of every 50 people right now is homeless on the streets, that's actually really important to put in there. And so we learned things like that too. And yeah, so I'm just a fan of like any data as long as it's cheap, and then a little bit more money if it's valuable in telling a story or kind of helping us learn with the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's a great example. Thanks, Tim. There's a question for you, Tim, in the chat from Maureen in Oakville. Is your board supportive of data collection and spending all the dollars on those efforts?
I guess so. To be honest, the data we collect is rarely small enough that we have to ask for board approval, I guess is my answer to that. So, but they also haven't complained about it. So I guess, yeah, they are. I mean, I guess our approach with the board on things like this is we'll tend to take them, like here's what we're thinking about, what we're going to go grab with data or pay for, and we get their feedback. Sometimes they'll have good ideas about, have you thought about this, or can we also include this? And then we'll go do an RFP. Like, I think they trust us to within a certain amount. To be honest, yeah, data collection has never been a significant enough part of our budget where we had to take it to a 16 board member vote.
Thanks, Tim. So just a reminder to everyone, if you do want to ask a question or raise a comment, please do raise your hand or type it into the chat. Very happy to read it out for you. Walter, did you have any questions or comments you wanted to make? You're on mute if you're talking. No, maybe
I think
not.
a lot of people would appreciate me being on mute. It was really interesting. Thank you for that. One of the things that we've been learning is that maybe an initial investment in a festival may not show great results and may take a couple of years till you really start to see the fruit of your investment. Judy, do you have anything to say about that and how you would track over a period of time from a data point of view how well that investment is paying off?
In terms of specific events, it's all, if it's a free event, always tricky. There's been many attempts at trying to track free events, trying to track the number of people who come to a free event. What we used to do in the city when I worked with the events group there was we try to figure out some aspect of the event that we could count, like some way of signing people up, and then you'd be able to track that measurable aspect of it. Even though you might not know total numbers, you would know how many people went to this particular thing and entered this contest or something like that to supplement the crowd things. Cell phone data has now sort of changed the game, and cell phone data, if you can, it's a little expensive, but not horrifically so in comparison to the cost of the event. And it is really quite definitive. You're not capturing 100%, but you're capturing these days pretty damn close to 100% of the people who are coming, and provides a really objective way. If you're measuring over time, you just need to be consistent from year to year and make sure you're not comparing apples and oranges. Really. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Tom, I have another question. I think that this is for both of our resource people today. One of the things that we were reading in our literature and research was the whole question of vitality. That one of the indicators of a successful BIA or Main Street could be not only just how many people are going through, but what the behavior is like. Do you have anything to say about that? People, how many people are participating in a particular aspect of what's going on, or how many people talking to each other? Either of you, either Judy or Tim?
No, sorry. Can I ask for the question to be rephrased?
Yeah, well, the High Street Commission in the UK and others have been really talking about how vital is an area. It's not just numerical, because some of this is more quantitative and I think, Tim, you were getting to this, of observation. how well is the area working in terms of how many people not are just there, but what are they doing? Are they talking with one another? Are they participating in various parts of the of an activity? It's one of those things that is now growing in how do we assess how successful a BIA or a Main Street might be.
Can we throw that question to the whole group? Are BIAs valuable? No.
Well,
you know what my answer to that is going to be very general, Walter, is I think that BIAs and probably any business association and industry group, like we've all probably shown that we're more valuable than ever because of the pandemic. And I think businesses really appreciate what we do, because when the pandemic happened and no one knew what was happening with the world, I mean, we all had to adjust, but the BIAs had some things available that they could provide as resources. We had some free time we could move into it. Like I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I feel like coming out of the pandemic, there's going to be some cynic that disagrees with me, but I think that society in general will have more of an appreciation for what the government does in terms of organizing resources and services and benefits across the entire of our Canadian civilization. And I think at the very small scale, like organizations like ours that represent one type of business or one neighborhood, I think we've kind of shown that we can be very valuable in terms of being flexible and kind of just knowing the neighborhood to frame the questions that need to be asked or to answer them in some cases.
Mm-hmm. I could add, my mind is going back to the study that Ontario BIA Association did a number of years ago. I forget how many years ago. And trying to do just that, Walter, is establish how does a BIA measure its return on investment. And it's a very big report, and they basically came up with 6 key indices. The most central was gross domestic. They called it the gross downtown product, which was kind of an amalgam of the proportion of tax in the area, the concentration of tax and property assessment in the downtown or in the BIA in comparison to the rest of the municipality, and how that was changing. But of course, there's so many factors that are independent of an actual BIA's activity, so that you, generally speaking, have to rely on other measures too. And things like, if you have, it depends on what the BIA does, streetscape improvements, how much investment has it encouraged? Is there a correlation between what you've spent on enhancing the streetscape and the amount of property development that's happened in the nearby area? That kind of thing some BIAs have tried to do. To demonstrate in at least correlation, if not causal relationships. And then, as you said, Tim, just being able to influence is so important. Being able to tell the story, which was done certainly through the pandemic, tell the story about the impact on the business community, and persuade the public sector to support them to the extent they did, was, I think, a real success of having those advocate voices.
Can I thank you for that. I think that's one of the issues that, as we begin to understand, and Tim, I think your comments were very valuable, the role that BIAs play in not just this piece that's under the legislation, but within the community. Does it provide a heart to the community? Are there people talking to each other? Are there kids playing around? How vital is a place? Becomes an important part, I think, of the argument that we can make why a BIA is an important part of the city, and so that tends to be more qualitative. I'm asking, it's not sort of the data. Pedestrian counts tell you one thing, but watching behavior might give you a different sense of how well your BIA is working. Would you agree with that? Either Tim or Judy?
I think I almost want to throw that question back to the group too. Judy, do you want to speak to that?
I think for sure. I mean, it's not a simple question to answer. It doesn't have a simple answer, but I think for sure it demonstrates the value. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my point is that there may be data points that we're getting that may or may not lead us to understanding that we may need softer, more qualitative approaches to at times understanding how well an area is doing. And there's a lot of research that indicates in place research about how that works. And so I'm just saying, I'm just raising that as an issue.
I think you're kind of highlighting what I was saying about like my joke about massaging the data, where you want to have different data sources always available, so that when you get more data sources or more anecdotes, you have different things you can compare to. Because it's very difficult to tell the story with only one report or one data set, I find. Well, another example I'll give of like a really cheap survey we did is we had those like light up seesaws a few years ago. It was like probably still one of my favorite things we've ever done here. I was like obsessed with trying to get them here before somewhere else in Toronto had them. And we do that in the winter. So one thing I inherited here was that the BIA was willing to invest more in winter activation because it's not very busy here. So we were willing to invest when we knew there weren't going to be people to give them a reason to come down. And we actually we hired a few extra people to just go out every night. And again, just ask people, like, where did you come from? Are you from the neighborhood or did you come from far away? And the huge win for us was that we were consistently hearing every night that no matter how many thousands of people that came, I think there was up to 5,000 were coming to see it each night. That was a rough count they were doing, just kind of their estimate. Don't lie to us, just tell us how many people did you count. And more than 50% every day were saying they came from outside of the neighborhood. So like in the fall on the waterfront, to have even a couple thousand people come down was like a huge win for us, just to draw attention to the waterfront at that time of year. And it really wasn't a hard data point, but it was just another data point we could use.
Right. Thank you.
I'm going to go to Carly. Carly, you got your hand raised. Please feel free to come off mute.
Thanks, Tom. My question's for Tim. I'm curious, the way that you've shown through your presentation the data that you've collected and the way that it's being utilized by the city. Have you put a lot of effort, because I think you showed that for both BIAs that you had worked for. So I'm just curious about the efforts that you've put into building the relationships with the municipality. Are you determining the data that you need collected to inform your programs? Are you getting input from that from the municipality, and vice versa? Like what does the collaboration effort look like? Or does it just sort of happen that you collect the data and they snatch it and use it because it benefits them?
Well, yeah, I think you're raising a good point that I kind of missed, which is that of course we do advocacy to all three levels of government, but 90% is to the municipality in one way or another, city staff or councillors' offices. And we definitely take feedback from them too. Like I send them information if we have it and we think it'll help influence the conversation, but we'll also listen too. And that's how we ended up doing some of these reports, was even the politicians and city staff couldn't give us answers. So it's like, okay, which consultants can we go to go get it? Like I guess this should always be in dialogue with your elected leaders or whoever the decision makers are, right? So the answer is yes, but it's part of, like, you have to develop those relationships. But I guess what I'm saying is having this data available can help you develop those relationships with different levels of government, because they'll see you as valuable, right? Like this isn't just about the business that's finding the data valuable. It's about other decision makers finding it valuable, I guess.
I think we live in a community, we've got one BIA and we've got a number of chambers of commerce to do. So it's different, they've got a different sort of scope of work, but sort of fill that role in some of their communities they place. But I tend to find that they talk to the municipality and say, this is the data that we need for the municipality to go and collect it. So I'm just interested that it seems like your BIA is taking the initiative to go in and collect it and then inform the policy from the municipality. So it's sort of switched a little bit.
Carly, I've been to Fenelon Falls many times.
Good.
You know, can I give another example? So I won't say who it was, just in case she doesn't want this shared, but one of the BIAs in downtown Toronto, start of the pandemic, she just went and counted how many businesses looked like they were closed. And not only did she inform politicians with that about how hard businesses were impacted, but it got her on TV a lot, talking about, like, she became an authority on like a major issue, businesses impacted by the pandemic, by literally going and counting which businesses were, like, that's how easy this can be. You don't have to pay a consultant. Sorry to the consultants on the line today. You can literally just go and count things and sometimes be the best source of data on a big issue, right? So that's what I would say. Like, don't ever be discouraged by not having the budget or not having the right connections. Just go and do it.
I agree, by the way, even though I am a consultant now. I can't leave my public sector completely behind.
And that was a question I had. I mean, some of the stories that we've picked up over the last year or so, of some BIAs that pre-pandemic were just collecting data on an ongoing basis anyway, store counts, that type of stuff. And the value that brought them once the pandemic hit, because then they had that comparison to say things are changed in this level. And I guess that's an investment of time and energy in figuring out what are some kind of key metrics that we can collect on an ongoing basis that isn't going to cost us a whole lot of time and energy. But should something change, should something, we can look at those trends. So we're not trying to answer a very specific question today about a specific event, but just to see what changes over time. And I guess Judy and Tim and anyone else on the call, obviously there's store counts and things like that. Do you know of any other pieces of information that you're collecting or you see other BIAs collecting?
I think store count is really important. If you can get borrowing and get a little bit more in floor space, but even store count and vacancy rate, the proportion of your portion of your ground floor space that is vacant. And again, the easiest is by numbers, but floor space will give you a more precise idea about impact. So those are probably two really key ones. And then business mix would be the next one, is what proportion are of different kinds of businesses, which gives you both a sense of how your business mix is changing over time. Is it out of tune with your market? And if it is out of tune with your market, why would that be? And then you can start looking in more detail at the whys. But the general trend through the years has been a reduction in the number of retail stores and an increase in the number of services, especially restaurants, but also entertainment services and in general recreation. These days, the big trend on almost everywhere is the increase in cannabis retailing as a result of the change in legislation. So that is a huge boom right now. I think it probably will stop being a boom soon, but it's understanding how does my area compare with everybody else on those key variables.
Great, thanks, Judy.
Thanks for having us on, Tom.
No problem. Any last? We're getting close to 1 o'clock. Any last comments or questions from anyone in the call? I see Matthew's been asking about some reports. I'll make sure Judy gets that question.
Oliver already put it in the chat. Thanks, Oliver. I was having a hard time multitasking.
Don't we all?
Listen, find the URL, type, too much.
I'll put my email in the chat too, just in case anyone wants anything that we referred to.
That's great. Thanks.
We can't hide anything if you ask for it.
Thanks so much. And Judy, feel free to drop your contact details in there as well.
Yeah, I put it in the presentation slide, which I'm assuming, but that I can cope with.
So Tim, Judy, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your insights. Some big questions, those big and small questions that can be answered with these types of data. And it's not just a 1 hour topic, but I hope we've kind of dipped in and given a couple of ideas and raised some questions. I'm just going to type into the chat. This is our newsletter, so I really encourage you to sign up for our newsletter and learn about our next events. And we will be in touch soon. So thank you very much to everybody on the call, and